there's no such thing as a dragon. Billy Bixby was rather surprised when he woke up one morning and found a dragon in his room. It was a small dragon, about the size of a kitten. The dragon wagged its tail happily when Billy patted its head. Billy went downstairs to tell his mother.
"There's no such thing as a dragon,"
said Billy's mother, and she said it like she meant it. Billy went back to his room and began to dress. The dragon came close to Billy and wagged its tail, but Billy didn't pat it. If there's no such thing as something, it's silly to pat it on the head. Billy washed his face and hands and went down to breakfast. The dragon went along. It was bigger now, almost the size of a dog. Billy sat down at the table. The dragon sat down on the table. This sort of thing was not usually permitted, but there wasn't much Billy's mother could do about it. She'd already said that there was no such thing as a dragon, and if there's no such thing, you can't tell it to get off the table. Mother made some pancakes for Billy, but the dragon ate them all. Mother made some more, but the dragon ate those too. Mother kept making pancakes until she ran out of batter. Billy only got one of them, but he said that's all he really wanted anyway. Billy went upstairs to brush his teeth. Mother started clearing the table. The dragon, who was quite as big as Mother by this time, made himself comfortable on the hall rug and went to sleep. By the time Billy came back downstairs, the dragon had grown so much he filled the hall. Billy had to go around by way of the living room to get to where his mother was.
"I didn't know dragons grew so fast,"
said Billy.
"There's no such thing as a dragon,"
said his mother firmly. Cleaning the downstairs took Mother all morning, what with that dragon in the way and having to climb in and out of windows to get from room to room. By noon, the dragon filled the house. Its head hung out the front door, its tail hung out the back door, and there wasn't a room in the house that didn't have some part of the dragon in it. When the dragon awoke from his nap, he was hungry. A bakery truck went by. The smell of fresh bread was more than the dragon could resist. The dragon ran down the street after the bakery truck. The house went along, of course, like a shell on a snail. The mailman was just coming up the path with some mail for the Bixbys when their house rushed past him and headed down the street. He chased the Bixbys' house for a few blocks, but he couldn't catch it. When Mr. Bixby came home for lunch, the first thing he noticed was that the house was gone. Luckily, one of the neighbors was able to tell him which way it went. Mr. Bixby got in his car and went looking for the house. He studied all the houses as he drove along. Finally, he saw one that looked familiar. Billy and Mrs. Bixby were waving from an upstairs window. Mr. Bixby climbed over the dragon's head, onto the porch roof, and through the upstairs window.
"How did this happen?"
Mr. Bixby asked.
"It was the dragon,"
said Billy.
"There's no such thing,"
Mother started to say.
"There is a dragon.
Billy insisted.
A very big dragon."
And Billy patted the dragon on the head. The dragon wagged its tail happily. Then, even faster than it had grown, the dragon started getting smaller. Soon, it was kitten size again.
"I don't mind dragons this size. Why did it have to grow so big?"
said Mother.
"I'm not sure, but I think it just wanted to be noticed,"
said Billy. The end.
Morning, guys. Morning. Want to welcome everybody here to AHM Connect. It's where we give hope and direction for men through biblical teaching. Turn on my, how's that? Thank you. And I also want to thank the guys here that served our country. Very grateful for your service. I have two son-in-laws who are both Marines, and I want to thank them as well. As we get started, I want you to just sit back here for a second and just enjoy the following pictures, okay? So sit back, you ready? Let's enjoy. Okay, besides laughter, what do these pictures stir in your hearts as men? Nothing? Nothing? What else besides nothing? What do they stir inside you? Anybody? Contentment. Okay. Is that another way of saying boredom? They were a little boring, weren't they? Now sit back and let's try some other pictures. See where they take you. Now, how about those? What do those stir inside you? Huh? Yeah. Why the difference in the first set of pictures and the second set of pictures? The first set of pictures made you feel maybe a little content, maybe a little sleepy, maybe a little bored. What was going on in those pictures? Yeah.
Maybe the girls like the first ones.
Say that again?
Maybe the girls like the first one.
Maybe, but we're not talking about girls here, but I get what you're saying. What are we talking about here? What were those pictures? They were just family, but there was not a lot of action or movement. How about the second set of pictures? Lots of action. Excitement, conflict, power, strength. Now, let me ask you this. What might this suggest? We were all a little like, oh yeah, those are nice in the first set of pictures, but the second set of pictures, you kind of sat forward a little in your chair because there was action, there was movement, there was power, there was strength, there was conflict. What might that suggest about us as men? Might it say something about how God made us? Well, we're going to continue in our third talk in our series, What is a Man? And the subtitle is The Most Important Question a Man Must Answer. Who you are as a man and what that means for you in this world is the most important question you or I or any man can ever ask and find the answer to. And why is that? Well, it's because our world is falling apart. And the world is falling apart because God made the world to need men. The world needs you, the world needs me, the world needs men. But not just any men, men with moral character, men with moral clarity, men who have moral courage, and men who, when the going gets tough, they don't quit, they have moral resolve. The world needs these kind of men because God made the world to function with these kind of men. Men who engage the chaos monster. That's what the world needs. And so our purpose of our series then on What is a Man is to challenge us as men to accept the responsibility before God that He has given us to become the men He created us to be and that the world needs. Your marriage needs this kind of a man that God created you to be. Your family needs it. Your community needs it. The world needs it. And so if you were here last time, how many of you were here last time? Most of you. If you were here last time, then let's just review. Remember we said that the key biblical passage that we are going to look at, that we're going to camp on, is this. 1 Corinthians 16:13. And it says this, be on guard, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Be on guard, stand firm in the faith, act like what? Men, be strong. Now, if you're here, remember we made several observations regarding that text. First, act like men can also be translated be manly. It can also be translated be men of courage. All three of those ways are legitimate ways for it to be translated. But something else you may not notice, but in the Greek text in which the New Testament was written, it's an imperative. An imperative means a what? A command. We are commanded to act like men in this world. So it's not an option. It's not a suggestion. It's what God requires of you and me. He has made us to be men, and He requires us to live like men. Be manly, be men of courage, act like men. It's a command. And then we said, well, if it's a command to act like men, there must be an assumption behind that command. And what's the assumption? The assumption is this: the command presupposes a standard. And not just a standard, a recognized standard that the original readers would have understood. In other words, there are ways to act like men, and there are ways not to act like men. It's not just you're a man, so any way you act is acting like a man. There's a standard by which to measure whether you're acting like a man or not acting like a man, whether I'm acting like a man or I'm not acting like a man. And so we ask this question: if God commands you and me to act like men, it's not an option, it's not a suggestion, it's a command. And if there exists a manhood standard to measure our obedience to that command, whether we're acting like men or not, then the question is, what is that standard, and where is that standard found? What is the standard by which I am going to measure, am I acting like a man or not acting like a man? And if there is a standard, where can it be found? And so in answering that question, I suggested to you, if you remember, a rule in Bible study. There's a rule in Bible study, and it basically says this: while the Bible was written for us, it was not written to us. The Bible is written for our benefit, for the growth in our faith, so that we will come to know and love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. But while it was written for us, it was not written to us. It was written to who? The original readers that originally read this after, in our case, 1 Corinthians, Paul wrote it. And so the original readers would have been first century Jewish and Greek readers that would have heard this command through a different framework than we hear it. Well, we're going to talk about the framework we hear this next time. We hear it more through an evolutionary story. But what the original readers heard it from was through what we're going to call the creation story. And it was the creation story back in Genesis 1 and 2 that was in their mind when they heard this, act like a man. And it was that creation story that formed the standard. It was the source of the standard of manhood. And it was that standard of manhood that came from the creation story then that was the basis for acting like a command, or acting like a man. In other words, the command, act like a man, what is the manly standard? Well, you got to go back to the standard to know what it means to act like a man. And where do you get the standard? Where do you get the standard to act like a man? You go back to the creation story. And so that's what we want to do. This means that if we're going to obey the command to act like men, then what we need to do is that we need to measure this masculine standard. What does it mean to be a man, and what does it not mean to be a man, on the basis of one thing. And you know what it is? It is the biblical story of creation. And so our purpose today, then, is to go back to Genesis 1 and 2. If you were here last time, I just gave you a little preview, but we want to go into a little bit more depth today. And we want to unpack the origin story of men. Because if you want to know what a man is, you got to go back to when a man was first created and what he was created for. So we want to go back to our origin stories as men, which is found in Genesis 1 and 2. And we want to use that origin story of manhood then to form the standard of what it means to be a man. And once we have that standard, then we want to apply that manhood standard from the creation story to the command to act like men. Okay, that's what we want to do. And in doing that, we're going to be following the the Bible study rule that the Bible was written for us, how to act like men, but it was not written to us. It was written to men in the first century who would have understood that standard in a very different way than we do today. Okay? So that's where we're going to go. You ready? So the origin story of men. Where did we come from as man? Well, before Genesis describes the creation of men, you and me, it first introduces us to the God who created man. It introduces us to our Creator. And it tells us that in Genesis 1, at creation's beginning, the Creator God was fully present in a very chaotic, uninhabitable place. Remember how Genesis 1 starts? In the beginning, God created in the heavens and the earth was what? Without form and void, and darkness covered the face. It was a very chaotic, uninhabitable place, but God is fully present. The Spirit of God hovered over all of that. And then God begins to do something. He speaks and moves into the chaos, creating a world of order, beauty, and life. He looks at the chaos, he moves into it, and he speaks, and he acts, and he creates a world of order, beauty, and life. And then right at the end of Genesis 1, he forms mankind in his image. Having created the world, he then forms mankind in his image and places them in his good world and tells them, in this good world, I want you to do one thing. I want you to thrive and I want you to flourish. That's the God who created us. Fully present in chaos, speaks and moves into the chaos to bring order, beauty, and life. And he creates an environment where we and his human family can flourish. And God declares all of this very good. It's all very good. Nothing bad about it at all. Now, I want you to note the manner in which God creates. And again, this is going to be important, as you're going to see in a minute. But let's notice a little bit more about this Creator God. Genesis 1 says that God speaks 10 times into a place that is formless, that is void, and that is dark. Now, this formless and void and dark place are three Hebrew words that together describe an unordered, uninhabitable, watery, dark abyss, that the darkness is so thick that it's paralyzing. There can be no movement, there can be no life, there can be no, it's the opposite of creation. It's non-creation. You can't exist in a place like this. And God is there and he speaks 10 times into it. Then God said, then God said, then God said. And all this is chaos. This is the chaos monster. Now, as God speaks into the chaos, he brings order to the chaos by engaging this dark, unordered, inhabitable abyss. He speaks in order to bring order. And this order is put together in a framework of day and night. So he speaks, and it's day 1. He speaks again, and it's day 2. He speaks again, and it's day 3. He's bringing order to the chaos, and it begins by putting this day-night framework together. Now notice, days 1 through 3, God speaks and moves. The whole time, Genesis, the first 3 days, he's speaking and moving, and he's dispelling the chaos by creating 3 purposefully ordered realms. He's creating order, and he's creating 3 realms. The first realm is time. The second realm is the sky and the sea. And the third realm is land and vegetation. In other words, you got this big glob, and every time God creates, he's creating 3 different realms. Time, which is linear. Then he creates the sky and the sea. He separates them. And then he separates the land from the sea, and he creates the land and the vegetation. So 3 realms of existence, days 1 through 3. And then God moves and speaks in days 4, 5, and 6, and he acts to fill those 3 realms with appropriate, functional inhabitants. And so he fills the realm of time with sun, moon, and stars, which give the seasons. He fills the sea, the sky and the sea, with birds and fish, and he fills the land and vegetation with beasts and man. And all of this, God says, is good. It's very good. It's the Hebrew word tov. The word tov can also be translated beautiful. It's a perfectly ordered with beauty and life. The idea is that God is an artist, and he's looking back and he's at his creation and says, every day, after each day, man, that's good. Man, that is beautiful. That is ordered just the way it's supposed to be. And so God pronounces goodness on this ordered creation. Now, with that in mind, I want you to know two questions. I want to ask two questions. First, why does God act to turn the chaotic darkness into a place of order, beauty, and life? God moves and speaks and acts to take the chaos and to create a place of order, beauty, and life. Why does he do that? Well, we learn in Genesis 1 at the end, and we're going to learn in Genesis 2, we're going to see that God is creating a good environment where his human family that he's going to create and put in there, where they can thrive and flourish with him and with each other. God is acting on our behalf. He's acting to place us into a world that we can flourish in, that we can thrive in. Why? Because it's not a place of disorder, it's a place of order. It's not a place of violence, it's a place of beauty. It's not a place of death, it's a place of life. Now, how does God turn this chaotic place into a good environment for human flourishing? Well, again, I want you to see is he directly speaks and he actively moves into the chaos with creative, chaos-ordering, life-giving power. That's the God we're being introduced to in Genesis 1. Now, a footnote. This environment that God creates for his human family so that we can thrive in provides 5 things. Notice, he provides us a place to live with him in Eden. Now, Eden is just a small place. The world is outside Eden. And God places us in Eden with him. Eden is God's home on earth. And we're going to live with him on earth. That's God's plan. And so we have a safe home. Second, God provides provision for life. There's the lush garden. Everything we need is there. Abundant food. Third, God provides a purpose for living. He says he says to subdue and tame the world outside the Garden of Eden. In other words, we have meaningful work. And then lastly, he provides people to love. The man and the woman, it wasn't good that man was alone, so he provides the woman, and they become one flesh, and out of that one flesh, they create a family. And what I want you to see is that God provides loved ones. He provides a close family. He provides people to do life with. And all of this is centered in and around a God to worship. We are to trust him, we are to love him, and we are to obey him because he gives us our home, he gives us our food, he gives us our work, he gives us our family. And we worship and serve him and center all of our lives around him. That's what God provided for us in this chaotic world that he shaped and formed so that we could flourish. He is our source of life. And so then, our origin story, where you and I come from as men, begins in Genesis 1 by introducing us to the God who created us, the God who created men. It's important for us to see that. And this God is fully present as he speaks and moves forward with life-giving power into the chaos of a dark, disordered, uninhabitable abyss. That's what God is doing. And then second, it's out of this chaos that God creates a very good world of order, beauty, and life, where his human family can thrive and flourish in a life-giving, God-centered, relationally oriented place. You see that? It's all there in Genesis 1. And he is going to tell us about who we are, but before the author of Genesis tells us who we are, he first introduces us to the God who made us. You say, well, why is that important? You'll see in just a second. So what happens next? Well, after introducing us to the God who created us, we are then introduced to the man that God created. Okay? Genesis 1:27 is where it first begins. It says, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So God creates everything. He orders everything. And now, right at the end of Genesis 1, he is going to give us an understanding. This is where he's first going to describe that he creates human beings. Not just men, but he creates what? Men and women both. Now, two things. This is the first mention of our creation as men. Okay, I already said that. But the second thing I want you to notice is this. Genesis 1:27 is poetry that gives a general description of humankind as binary. And what's binary mean? It's made up of two parts, male and female. But it's not just male and female, it's male and female image bearers. Let me show you something, the poetry here. Notice line 1 and line 2. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Notice how it says the same thing, but in reverse order. You see that? God created mankind, he created him in his own image, in the image of God. This in Hebrew is called chiastic parallelism. And what it means, it's saying the same thing, except it reverses the order. He is just telling us one thing. Mankind is made in the image of God. That's the important thing we need to see here. Then in line 2 and line 3, he says the same thing, but in a different way. This is called straight parallelism. Notice, he created him, second line, he created them, third line. Saying the same thing, right? But now notice, in the image of God, male and female. You know what this is telling us? This is telling us that the image of God and male and female are to be understood as the same thing. Now, what does that mean? Genesis 1:27 is telling us two things. First, it's telling us that humans uniquely bear the image of God. Animals don't, angels don't, only humans do. There's something special about humans. To bear God's image means that all humans are given a status, the status of representing God and reflecting God's likeness to the world. In other words, the image of God doesn't mean that we're smart or intelligent or that we have consciousness. Because if that's the image of God, then a fetus in the womb may not have consciousness yet, or an old man may lose consciousness. And if that's the case, then we don't bear the image of God. The image of God is not about intellect, emotion, or will. The image of God is about status. That we have been given a status like no other being has to represent God, his will, his desires, his purposes in this world, and to reflect his likeness to the world. That's what it means to bear the image of God. And all humans bear God's image. Whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, man or woman, young or old. Second, though, here's the important thing. There are two different kinds of human image bearers. There's a male image bearer and there's a female image bearer. In other words, it's not just we're image bearers that happen to be male and female. No, there's something about your maleness that reflects God and represents God that a woman's femaleness doesn't. Men and women are designed to reflect God equally, but differently through their maleness and femaleness. Which means then, as I said, women reflect something about God that men don't, and men reflect something about God that women don't. Now that's important for you and me. Why? Well, if we exist in the world as male image bearers created to reflect something about God through our masculinity, then the questions that we need to ask is this: what facet of God are we created to reflect that a woman doesn't reflect? And then secondly, how are we as men called to uniquely reflect that facet of God? So what is it that we're called to reflect about God, and what will that look like as a man? How does that present itself in the world? Now, these two questions are important. Why? Because how we answer these questions, what are we to reflect about God as men, and how are we reflect that through our masculinity, they will inform how we answer the question, what does it mean to act like a man? Without answering these questions, we won't know what it means to act like men. So in answering these questions, we are now going to begin to put together what? The masculine standard that is going to be coming out of what? The creation story that's going to tell us, that's going to be the basis for telling us how to act like a man and how not to act like a man. So, those two questions, and we'll begin to answer them after the break. Prior to the break, we said if men are male image bearers, we're not just image bearers who happen to be men, or we're not just physical, biological beings. We're male image bearers created to reflect something about God, a facet of His glory, a facet of His character, through our masculinity. That's what our masculinity is for. It's there to show something to the world about God. Then what facet of God are we created to uniquely reflect? Whatever it is, it'll be different than a woman is, but it'll be something that will stir us as men. That was our first question. And then if that's true, if we are created to reflect something about God, then how are men called to uniquely reflect that facet of God to the world? That's question 2. And we said that all of this is important to answer because how we answer these two questions will inform how we are to act like men. Okay? So what I want to do now is I want to just work through question number 1 and question number 2. Okay? So that's where we're going to go. So question number 1, what are men designed to reflect about God? Well, if you go back to Genesis 1:27, where we're first introduced to God creating human beings, remember it says God created us in His image, in the image of God He created them, male and female He created them. The word male is the word zakar in the Hebrew. And the word zakar, what it means in the Hebrew is this: the pointed one. We are the pointed ones. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, the word for female, God made them male and female. The word female is the word nakba, and it means the perforated one. Women are the perforated ones, and men are the pointed ones. You kind of get what it's talking about here? It's talking about sexuality, isn't it? It's describing us as pointed ones. Now, this is important to know because in the ancient Near East, when this was written, a name was always associated with three things: its identity, its purpose, and its function. So there's something about Zakar that is going to tell us something about who we are, what we're for, and how we're to do it. Okay? So let's look at this. The name Zakar speaks of a couple things: power, strength, movement, thrusting, fruitfulness, life, standing tall and erect. Guys, what I want you to see is our masculine sexuality is a description of our masculine personality. How we function sexually is a parable of how we are to be as men in this world. So Zakar speaks of power and strength and movement and fruitfulness and life. Now, our full name, Zakar Selim Elohim, male image bearers, made in the image of God, male and female, male image bearers, tells us this: that God designed men to represent him in this world. That's Selim. By reflecting our Creator's power, strength, and movement that brings order, creates beauty, and produces life. Now, identity. What's our identity? Because that's what a name is. Identity, purpose, and function. What's our identity? Well, our identity in this world is this: we are representing God. We image God. We are mirrors of God in this world. We are partners with him. That's our identity. Second, what's our purpose? Well, our purpose is to bring order, create beauty, and produce life. That's why we're here. We're not here just to make it, just to get along, just to pay the bills. We're here to bring order, to create beauty, and to produce life. And what's our function? How do we do that? Well, we do that by reflecting our God's or the Creator's power, strength, and movement. That's our function. We, as Zakar Selim Elohim, have been designed by God to represent him in this world by reflecting his power, strength, and movement that brings order, creates beauty, and produces life. That's why in the Bible, men are the only ones that are ever to be told to be strong. Did you know it never tells women to be strong? It only tells men to be strong. Deuteronomy 31:7, be strong and courageous, for you will lead these people into the land. It's talking to a man here. 1 Samuel 4:9, be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. Never says that about a woman. 2 Samuel 10:12, be strong and let us fight bravely for our people. 1 Kings 2:2, be strong, be manly, do what the Lord requires. And what does the Lord require here? To be a man. It never says this of a woman. And then even our passage, 1 Corinthians 16:13, be on guard, stand firm in the faith, act like men what? Be strong. He's not talking here to women, he's talking here to who? To men. Only men are ever told to be strong in the Bible, never women. And why might that be? Because there's something about a man that uniquely reflects the strength and power of God that a woman doesn't. In fact, for the Israelite man, circumcision, which was the surrendering of a man's zakar to Yahweh, that was the covenantal sign that the Hebrew man had with God. It was a surrendering of his zakar. How so? Well, his identity as a man. He was no longer to represent himself, but he was to represent who? God. His purpose as a man. He was no longer to bear fruit for himself or live for himself, but he's to live for who? He's to live for God. His function as a man. He was no longer to use his power for himself, but he was now to use his power for God. I mean, you ever wonder why God would have such a thing as, here's the sign of the covenant, cut off the foreskin of your penis? What is that about? Well, if you understand, that is representative of zakar. That is who we are. It's a surrendering of all we are as men to the Lord. And so then, question number one, what are men designed to reflect about God? We are zakar. We are male image bearers designed to reflect God's power, strength, and movement that brings order, creates beauty, and produces life. That's what men are for. That's who men are. That's how we do it. Question two, how has God called men to reflect that power and that strength and that movement to the world? What does that look like? Well, let's think with this a minute. In Genesis 1, we said Genesis 1 gives a general account of how God created the world, and it's going to focus on God's power to bring order from the chaos, right? He speaks and moves and acts, and the chaos turns to order. He's fully present in the chaos. He speaks and moves in the chaos. That's how we are introduced to the God who creates men. But then, in Genesis 2, it's going to give us a detailed account. It gave us a kind of a general account. He created male and female in his image. But now, in Genesis 2, it's going to give a more detailed account of how God created mankind, focusing on human responsibilities and functions. I've made you male and female image bearers. Now, here's what that's going to look like in the world as you live. That's what Genesis 2 is about. And what we're going to see is two things. First, God creates man from the dirt of the earth, and he assigns to the man certain responsibilities regarding loyalty to God and the care of creation. Then after creating the man, he creates the woman not from the dirt of the ground, but from where? The flesh of the man's side. For what reason? For the purpose of uniquely partnering with the man in the man's God-given assignments. Okay? So, what I want to focus on is that first one. After creating the man from the dirt, Genesis 2 verses 15 through 17 says this. Then the Lord God took the man, and he placed him in the garden. Why? To keep the garden and to guard the garden for the Lord. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it you shall surely die. And then the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what the man would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. Now I want you to notice something here. These are the first words that God speaks to human beings. Genesis 1, he isn't speaking to human beings. He's speaking to the angelic council. In Genesis 2, he finally speaks to human beings. He creates them and he speaks. Now, to whom does God speak in these first words? Who does he speak to? The man. Does he speak to the woman? No. He's speaking only to the man. Why only to the man? He doesn't speak to the woman at all here. Everything that he says here, he says to the man. Why do we know that? Well, we know it for one reason, because the woman has not yet been created. She's still on the man's side. She is going to be created later, and she is going to be told some things later. But for now, what I want you to see is that the first words God speaks, he speaks to you and me as men. And what is God saying? Well, he is telling the man, this is what you are going to be responsible for before me in this world. In other words, I've made you to reflect me as a man, and these are the responsibilities I'm going to give you as a man as you reflect me. What is a man responsible for? 4 things. The man is responsible to keep and maintain, or keep and guard, the existing goodness of the garden God established in creation. Here's the goodness of the garden. The man is to keep and maintain it, guard it, so nothing bad happens. Second, he's to guard and protect it. He's to bring order, beauty, and life of the garden from the intrusion of chaos outside. In other words, he's not only to maintain it, but there's still this chaos outside that he is to keep. And we're going to see, you see the chaos outside creep into the garden in what chapter? Chapter 3. But for now, the man is to guard and protect the order, beauty, and life that God has brought into the garden from this outside chaos. So keep and maintain the goodness, guard and protect from chaos. Thirdly, he was to be loyal to God by obeying the prohibition concerning the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and to tell it to others. The implication here is that this is the man's responsibility, that the only way to have flourish and to have goodness in life is to follow the Lord's way, to follow the Lord's wisdom. And in following the Lord's way, everything good will continue. Shalom will continue. And Adam was not only to obey that, but it was his responsibility to do what? To pass that message on. And specifically, he was to pass that on to Eve. Why Eve? Because Eve never heard it. Only Adam heard it. Adam was responsible to pass on the message. And then, fourthly, Adam was responsible to expand Eden's goodness outward into the raw, untamed world by doing 2 things: subduing the world and taming the world, bringing order to this unordered part of the world. And we see that, first of all, in Genesis 1, he makes us and he says, go out into the world to subdue it. But in Genesis 2, we see that same idea when he names the animals. The animals are a chaotic mess. And when Adam names the animals, what is Adam doing? He's bringing order. He's creating certain species, certain kinds. And the chaos, he's creating order, just like God did in bringing order to the chaos in Genesis 1. Now, why these responsibilities? Maintain the order, protect from chaos, be loyal to God in following his ways, the way he has set up creation to function and to work. Why these things? And then spread the goodness of Eden out into the world. Why these responsibilities? One reason, because the God of creation made men to be like him and to do what he does. That's why God made us. He tells Adam, Adam, I made you to be like me. And what am I like? I'm a God who does what? Who speaks and moves into the chaos to bring order, beauty, and life so that people can flourish. And Adam, I've made you to reflect me as Zakar, my power and strength and movement, that also moves into the chaos, to bring order, beauty, and life, to maintain that order, to protect that order from the outside forces that would seek to destroy it. And it's your job, your responsibility as a man to use your power on that behalf. Be like me and do what I have done. That's why it first introduces us to God. Because he says, this is God, chapter 1, chapter 2, now be like him. God made you guys and me to be like him. That's what it means to be a man. Like God, men are to speak and move with power and strength into chaos. Like God, men are to bring order and beauty and life to the disorder in the world. And like God, men are to preserve and protect the world from decreating forces of chaos. Let's look at the first one. Men are made to speak and move with power and strength. Why do you think that we were drawn to those second set of pictures? There's something in us that loves power and strength because guess what? There's something good about that God has made us to reflect about him. Why do you think the second one, men are to bring order, beauty, and life to the disorder in the world? Why do you think that men like to fix things? What things need to be fixed? Things that are broken and disordered. Men love to fix things because men are made to bring order. Why do you think it is that men are protective in nature and that we like to guard people and that type of thing? We like to guard our families and protect our loved ones. Why do you think that is? Because, like God, we were meant to use our power to that end. Why? So that the world can continue to be good, life-giving, God-centered place where people can thrive and flourish. Put another way, God made men to be like him so that as his human sons, we could share in his life and in his purposes and in his responsibilities in this world. Guys, we are made for something much bigger than just surviving in this world, than just getting ahead, getting a nicer car, paying off the bills, going to a better school, getting a better job. That's such a small way to think about who we are as men. And it's men who think like that, that's why the world is falling apart. Because men who think like that use their power for nothing bigger than what? Themselves. Guys, we were made to be like God, to use the power that he has put in us as Zakar for the sake of others and for the glory of his name. So with all that in mind, what is a man? Well, if we go back to the creation story, again, here's how we can define a man. A man is an adult human male image bearer who is created by God and endowed by him with the responsibility. That's a big word when it comes to what it means to be a man in the Bible. We have been endowed by God with the responsibility to do what? For advancing God's good purposes for human flourishing. How? By reflecting through our words and actions God's creative power that brings order and beauty and life to the chaotic and untamed world around us. Guys, we are called to slay the chaos monster. Not to avoid him, because when we avoid him, what happens to the chaos monster? He only grows and gets bigger. And when the chaos grows and gets bigger, what happens to those we love? What happens to the world around us? It begins to fall apart. That's why our world is falling apart today. Men are avoiding the chaos monster. And they've turned inward, we've turned inward to live only for ourselves. Guys, the world needs good men. Let's apply this now to 1 Corinthians 16:13, which is the command to what? Act like men. The command to act like men, in reality, is the command to be like the God of Genesis 1. When the original readers heard act like men, they didn't hear, like we hear it, be a tough guy or be a nice guy or be a whatever kind of a guy. They heard, be like the God of Genesis 1. That was the manhood scale that they measured what it meant to be a man. And guys, if we're going to be committed to following Jesus, he calls us to be men. It's not an option. It's not a suggestion. He made us men for a reason, and he's serious about what he's made us to be, and he wants us to be serious about that too. And if we are going to be the men he's created to be, then we have to say, what's the standard? And the standard doesn't come from how our culture tells us what a man is or what a man isn't. It has to come from what God says. And to know that, we got to go back to our origin story, found in Genesis 1 and 2. Now what this means then is to act like a man is to gladly assume responsibility for being fully present in the confusing, chaotic places of our worlds. Two of the biggest frustrations that most women have with their husbands: he's not present, and when he is present, he's not here. And he's not here because he's passive and he's silent. To act like a man is to gladly assume, not begrudgingly, but gladly assume. Why? Because that's what God has made us. Responsibility for being fully present. Not just given a couple minutes, being fully there in the confusing, chaotic places of our worlds. Guys, this isn't easy. We have to choose this, and we have to depend on God to be this kind of man. Why? So that we can move forward into those dark places with life-giving power, measured strength, and God-centered speech. Why? For the purpose of creating and preserving the good environments of order, beauty, and life. That's what we're here for. And what's the result? Well, when we act like that, God will be worshiped, people will thrive, relationships will flourish, and shalom, the way life is supposed to be, will be enjoyed. It also means that when we don't act like that, we fail to act like men when we ignore the chaos around us. And if you're alive and you live in this world, guess what's going to be around us? All measures of chaos. We fail to act like men when we avoid responsibility. We fail to act like men when we're silent and passive and not present. We fail to act like men when we use our power in selfish or in harmful ways. We fail to act like men when we forget and or we neglect God. You can't be a man and forget God, because what is a man? He's a reflector of God. You can't forget God, but when we do, we fail to be men. And when we fail to act like men, the results are always going to be the chaos in our life and family and our world grows. You know that's true, so do I. When we fail to be men, people will become divided and isolated in our homes, in our community, and around the world. When we fail to act like men, relationships will become empty and cold. They'll die. And that's when we as men typically then start turning to porn or affairs, because we long for a life-giving relationship, but one without chaos. And we fail to act like men. When we fail to act like men, God's presence and shalom will vanish. He'll be there, but we'll certainly not experience him. Likewise, we will hurt other men when we don't require responsibility from them. If you're in a men's group and all you're doing is complaining about how your wife is unfair and everybody's saying, yeah, get out of that men's group. Why? Because they're hurting you. They're not saying, yeah, I understand that, but as a man, what is your responsibility? And whether your wife is fulfilling that responsibility of hers, God still calls you to fulfill your responsibility. And guys, because women were made to be responsive to men, a woman will always respond to a man's leading, be it good or bad. And when a man avoids chaos, you know what a woman does? She begins to get bigger and angry because the man is not dealing with the chaos, and now she's going to do it. But always letting the man know that he's failing. Also, we train boys to run from manhood when we make excuses or help them too much. Guys, those of you who are fathers or will be soon fathers, the hardest thing to do is let your boys fail. But when they fail, you need to be there for them, not be ashamed of their failure and turn away from them. They need to feel your presence so that when they fail, you can talk about it and they can learn and grow. But when you keep them from failing or help them too much or make excuses for them, guess what they never learn? Responsibility. And if they never learn responsibility, guess what they never then learn? How to act like a man. However, you and I and our sons and boys will grow as men when we learn to gladly assume responsibilities given to us by God for the good of others. And guys, one of the things that we always need to remember is this. Those responsibilities that we gladly assume will always be costly. They are always sacrificial. To live out our calling, you have to sacrifice. You have to sacrifice your time, your power, your energy, your resources. But if we are to be like God in our manhood, then we will be sacrificial. Why? Because to be like God is to be sacrificial. All through the Bible, that's the one thing we learn about God. Did he get frustrated with us? Yeah. Did he deal with us appropriately for our failures? Yeah. But guess what? The one thing he never did. He never gave up on us. In fact, he went to the cross. He gave his son and he went to the cross. So that those things that kept us from being in his family, that kept us from being in as his sons, could be forgiven and we could be adopted back into his family as his sons, as men who he has made to partner with him in this world to advance his purposes for the sake of his glory and for the good of others. To be like God is to be sacrificial. So what do we learn today? Here's a summary of today. God made men to reflect him as Zakar. You are Zakar. You are the pointed one. We are the pointed ones. And to act like men then is to be like the God of Genesis 1. He is a God of power and presence. And as a result, we are stewards of God's power and presence as Zakar. That's our identity. He is a God of movement and speech, which means that we are to actively move and speak into the chaos and darkness just as he did. That's our function. And he is a God of order, beauty, and life, which means that as men, as a car, we are to create good and God-centered environments. That's our purpose in this world as Zakar. But we will only be that when we, like the men of Israel, perform a circumcision. Not on our body, but on our hearts. Because when we circumcise our Zakar, it's then that our identity is connected with him. We exist for him. Our function is for him. And our purpose is for him. Everything about our masculinity is centered in and around God. And guys, that's the way God created it to be. And that's what he has saved us to be, and that's what he is sanctifying and growing us back into the image of Christ to be, and that's what we will someday be when all things are made new. We will be Zakar, fully identified with God, fully functioning as he functions, and fully living for his purposes as our purposes. But until then, we're going to struggle. And you can't struggle alone. We got to struggle by knowing his word, meditating on his word, and talking about that with each other. Guys, the world needs good men. And we know that because the world is falling apart. Might we be those men that God needs and that he's created us to be, for the sake of the world and for his glory. Well, next time, December 9th, Session 4, we're going to do something a little different. We're calling it Cultural Manhood, the clash of Darwin and feminism on the battlefield of masculinity. We saw what it looks like to think about manhood from a storied perspective of the Bible, a creation account. But so often what we're confused with today is that we are thinking about our masculinity from a Darwinian account, social Darwinism, which is recently come under scrutiny and clashing with feminism. And it's in that clash going on today that we are thinking of ourselves as men. And what happens too often, not only in the world, but in the church, we take this clash, what's going on, and we adapt wherever the culture is, and we then think, oh, that's what it means to be a man, and that's what it not means to be a man. And so we then take this understanding and we apply it to 1 Corinthians 16:13. And I want us to have a better understanding of where all this came from. So we're going to have kind of a historical perspective on man in America and what's going on today. And hopefully we'll be able to better understand that, and as a result, better be able to distinguish what biblical manhood looks like from cultural manhood. Okay? Well, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time. Any questions?